Hi everyone. So, I'm doing a 1,000 subscribers Q&A because you guys have got me to 1,000 subscribers and that's really cool. Thanks. I'm doing it to camera, which I don't usually do, and without a script, so this is going to be really fun. And a little bit nerve-wracking. So yeah, I guess I better get on to doing some questions. Got a few different sorts of questions here. Some of them are kind of personal and either about me or about the channel. Then there's some theoretical questions, and then there's some which I think are just kind of a bit more fun. So I'm going to start, I think, with the personal questions, because they kind of come into a thread together, and then maybe sort of mix up the theoretical and the fun questions at the end. So yeah, let's get down to some questions. So the first question I've got here is from PD Morin, who runs a really good channel, and you should all go and watch it if you haven't seen any of his stuff before. And he's asked a question which Baffy asked him in his Q&A. Baffy, or Baphometrics, by the way, makes a lot of the amazing music that you hear on my videos and a lot of other BreadTube videos, so I just want to give her a shout out. But yeah, PD Morin asks me the question that she asked him on his Q&A, and it's a really good question, and I actually saw PD Morin answering this one, and I was kind of hoping someone would ask me this question, because it's a subject I quite like to talk about. So the question is, tell us about your personal evolution as a leftist. Were there any specific events in your life, or perhaps influential people, who helped you grow to where you are now? Well, I think from one of the starting points for my politics always came from my family, and my dad's parents had to leave Germany because they were half Jewish in the 1930s. So that was always something that was known about in our family and was something we were aware of in growing up. So I suppose in that way, the thought that a tyrannical government could come and upset your entire life, and inherently anti-fascism, was something that I sort of grew up with in a very sort of intrinsic way, just through the understanding of my own family history. So the next big thing that had a big impact on my political awareness, or at least my awareness of politics, was 9/11. It happened when I was 11 years old, and obviously it was a really shocking moment for much of the world. And it certainly was something that spurred me to start thinking that keeping up with current affairs was probably a good thing to do. But even more influential than that, I think, was the following Iraq War, which I think politicised both myself and many in my generation. I was a very passionate, if quite liberal, anti-war activist for a little bit. I used to try and promote anti-war ideas around my school, and I went on the largest protest in British history, which was the 2 million people who marched against the Iraq War back in 2003. But still, I was very liberal in my politics at that point. A lot of my arguments against the war were based on international legalism and things like that. But I was starting to become interested in more radical ideas. At some point around this time, maybe a bit later, I read the Communist Manifesto, although I don't think I really understood it very much at that point. But I still always had a bit of a problem identifying myself as a communist, although I would say I was kind of communist interested at the time. Another big influence on me was reading a fantastic book which I really recommend called The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. It tells the story of an American family who go to the Congo in the 1960s. The father is a missionary and is going there to try and convert the natives, and it's told through the diaries of his wife and daughters. It's a really, really good book, and you should go read it if you haven't. But there's one particular scene. So, because it's set against the backdrop of political events in the Congo at the time, there is one scene where the Congo is having its first election after being freed from Belgian rule. Obviously, this is the election that was won by Patrice Lumumba before he was assassinated by the CIA in order to bring in the barbaric reign of Mobutu. But the scene takes place in the village deep in the jungle where the family are staying and trying to convert the natives. And the father of the family, being the white male in the village, is tasked with explaining democracy to this tribal village. And because they're illiterate, they're doing it Athenian style with black and white pebbles. And, you know, it explains the father explaining democracy and saying, oh, you know, you vote for this person or you vote for this person, whoever has the most votes wins. And the chief comes back, and I don't have the quote here, but he says, how is that fair? what happens if there were 100 of us and 51 people wanted one thing and 49 wanted the other? How is that fair? And, the father says, oh, well, that's because the most get their way, and then that's the fairest it can be. And the chief says, no, well, when we sit down in our community and we make a decision, we don't just go until the most people are satisfied. We discuss it until everyone agrees, and we, make some exceptions to try and get around problems for certain people, and we try and discuss it until everyone agrees on a decision. And so I suppose reading that, I was really impressed by the idea, and it was my first introduction to the notion of consensus decision-making or direct democracy. And so I really liked this idea, and I used to try and play with it in my head, but I didn't really understand it or know what tradition it came from, and I came up with some pretty wild names for it, like neo-tribalism and things like that, in my naive teenage mind. But it was an idea that stayed with me and that I was quite keen to sort of keep thinking about. One of the next big changes for me came just before I went to university, when I went to Leeds Festival in the UK. A really commercial festival. I went a few times. I probably wouldn't necessarily go back unless there was a band I really wanted to see. But it just so happened that year, Rage Against the Machine were playing. And I had a Rage album. I was vaguely a bit into them. But I went to the show and I'd been up all night the night before in various states of inebriation. And then I'd been dancing for several hours in the front with my girlfriend at the time, listening to Queens of the Stone Age and a few other bands that were on. And Rage were headlining, so it was the last thing of the night. And I said to my girlfriend at the time, oh, I'm really tired. Can we just watch from the back and maybe we'll go a bit before the end because I'm really, really tired. And so we went quite near the back and the stage was just absolutely packed. And as soon as the first chord rang out of Rage's set, the energy was really high. And I knew at that point I definitely wasn't going anywhere until the end of the set. And I was absolutely blown away. The atmosphere was amazing. People were dancing even back where we were. And afterwards, you really kind of had a feeling like you wanted to go out and start some sort of a revolution. So I found that really inspiring. And again, it sounds kind of cheesy, but I kind of think it's a good thing that these sorts of experiences can lead people to more things. So I went out and bought every CD Rage had ever made, and I even bought a live DVD, The Battle of Mexico City. And it was on that DVD that I saw they had these documentary chunks in between the bits of the show where they talked about Mexican politics and the Zapatistas, and where I first heard of a student occupation, which was something quite exciting to find out about. And also on the extra features, among other things, they had Zach de la Rocha interviewing Noam Chomsky. And I thought this was really interesting, and I was really interested in the things that Chomsky had to say. And so I went out and bought Deterring Democracy by Noam Chomsky and found out about US interventionism in Latin America and the cynical way in which our society holds up the term democracy. And then I went and watched about 100 hours of Chomsky speeches on YouTube, which kind of eventually got to the point where I felt like I had a little Noam Chomsky in my head. And that was really how I came to realize that this idea that I'd had some clue to before from the Poisonwood Bible by Kingsolver had a name and had a tradition. And I realized that what I was an anarchist. At the same time as this, I was just starting university. I'd kind of grown up through quite a rave-orientated culture and was also quite on a hippie scene and quite into a lot of fun things that hippies like to do. And maybe I went through a bit of a embarrassingly spiritual phase for about a year. But on the tail end of that, I kind of came out of it and realized that for a long time I'd sort of thought about trying to do something like political activism and thought that that would be something really cool to do. But at this point, having watched all this Noam Chomsky, and also I was just finishing the first year of my philosophy degree, I kind of felt like I could argue the point. I'd always been worried that if I went out on the street and started campaigning for things, someone might ask me a question I wouldn't be able to answer, and then I might become unsure about what I was doing. But by this point, I felt that I could pretty much answer most questions that were thrown at me about it. I felt pretty secure in where I was coming from. And so that was when I kind of went out and started getting involved in political activism. I joined a broad front cross-left group called Left Unity, not the political party that now exists in the UK, but it was a local group. And I started doing a little bit of low-level activism here and there, involved with some trade union movements and things like that. So I was getting involved in a few groups and doing a little bit of light activism. There wasn't really an anarchist group on Tyneside at the time, but I did have some very supportive people from the older end of the left who really helped me find my feet. There was one activist who'd been active in the area for a very long time called Paul, who really helped me learn what all the different groups were around and which ones you could trust and which ones you couldn't. And that's a really important thing to learn if you're going out and doing some activism in your area, because there are a lot of really shit activist groups out there. In the UK, my personal suggestion would be to avoid anything that's related to the Socialist Workers' Party and probably pretty much any Trotskyist group. They're mostly terrible. No offence if you're in one, but it's not for me. But yeah, there were some great people who kind of helped me and took me under their wing and helped me to learn a bit more about trying to organise in real life. But the most exciting breakpoint to me is something that I talked about a bit in my collaboration with Radical Reviewer recently. If you haven't seen that, go check it out on Radical Reviewer's channel. After the Millbank protests in London, where student activists went and occupied and smashed up the Conservative Party headquarters, I was involved in the student occupations that then happened in 20 or so universities around the country in 2010. This was in my third year of university, and so I was maybe an even more confident anarchist who had been studying philosophy for nearly a whole degree now and was quite righteous in what I was doing. But this experience was something else. And there was, 60 of us living for 3 weeks in the fine art department of Newcastle University. And it was an absolutely wonderful experience. We did direct action almost every day, at least at the start, when we could mobilise without being shut down quickly by the university authorities. We briefly occupied the council chamber of our local civic centre where the council sits. All sorts of exciting things. And we were leading marches of 1,000 or more people in Newcastle, which is a small city, and that was a really big thing then. And I haven't seen very many marches that big since those occupations. And that was a really exciting time when we were able to experiment with communal living and living in a purposeful political community, and that was incredibly exciting to me, and that was a really big inspiration for my political activity for the rest of my life. So I've kind of rambled a bit, and I think I should probably try and cut this question a bit short now. But yeah, after that I went on and I was involved in the Newcastle branch of the Occupy movement the next year. Occupy in the UK I don't think was quite the same as what it was in the US. Maybe a discussion of how Occupy panned out here is something I can do in another video. After that, I sort of began thinking a lot more about how I wanted to approach activism and about how the anarchist movement should relate to different groups within society. And I'm not going to go too much into this here, because I think I'm going to do an individual video on left strategy soon. But to put it briefly, I then started trying to work more with groups that were trying to do something positive in a community in a political way. The most significant being I worked with a group called Solidarity Federation, or Solfed, for a while, who are a grassroots syndicalist trade union and try and use collective power to win back wages and solve other issues for workers, particularly in ununionised or difficult to unionise workplaces. And if you're in the UK and fancy getting involved in something like that, they are a great group and I highly recommend you look them up. But that element of doing something positive while also spreading your political message is something that I do look for now in my activism. And I try to organise in groups which are trying to do that. But I will talk more about that, as I say, in another video. So, on to the next question. This question is from Katherine, another fantastic YouTube channel. Check her out. She's done some fantastic videos, particularly on Michael Jackson and childhood sexual abuse, and on veganism and anti-capitalism. And her video on voluntourism is very good as well. Check out her channel. So Katherine asks, what made you get started on YouTube? What are your goals on YouTube? And how did you come to have the political views you have today? Well, I've covered the last bit of that in how I came to have these political views. What made me get started on YouTube? Well, I suppose I'd always wanted to go back and do postgraduate work after university, and I did actually start a master's, which I kind of pulled out of in a hurry because I realised I couldn't afford to keep doing it because it was expensive. So that happened. But I always continued reading with a view to potentially going back and doing it. So I was keeping up with my philosophy, I suppose. And I guess I was kind of between political organisations for a while because I didn't feel like there were any particularly positive projects that I could be involved in happening in my area, which suited my politics. And actually my flatmate and collaborator on this channel, Blue Legenda, started introducing me to LeftTube, BreadTube videos that they'd started finding. This was a few years ago. The first one that we watched was ContraPoints Alpha Males video, I think. And that was just at the time one of my favourite things that I'd ever seen on YouTube. And then we discovered Sean and H-Bomber Guy and started getting into the expanding BreadTube community. I suppose I started toying with the idea of making my own channel about a year and a half ago, and there were a few times I kind of talked to people I knew who could edit video and started trying to talk about maybe I would write scripts and record them and they would edit the videos for it, because I couldn't edit video. And I was about to start doing it actually just about this time last year, and then I got a new job and had no time at all, and the idea went into the background for a while. But then when I left that job, I sort of felt like that this was the opportunity to finally start the channel. And actually one of the hardest things about that was choosing a name, which took a really long time. But I decided to start the channel and I decided to start doing my own video editing and just teach myself to do it, which turned out to be much easier than I thought it was going to be. And then, sort of organically, Blue started doing the animations for the more complicated bits that I didn't yet know how to do. And we sort of developed this working relationship where Blue was able to pick up anything complicated and exciting I wanted to do on screen but didn't really know how to do. And yeah, that's how it started. As for the goals of the channel, well, first and foremost, I like sharing ideas and the education I have. And I suppose in many ways, I felt often when discussing these ideas with people, I had to lay out a lot of arguments in a row, and I thought it might be easier just to be able to say, oh, I have a video on this. And because I think a lot of these ideas are important and important to spread. I was really excited and inspired by some of the comments PhilosophyTube made. I forget which video he made these comments in, about how compared to academic works of philosophy, his videos received, a lot more views than they tended to sell copies. I started to get the sense that there was this really vibrant essay writing community on YouTube, which I kind of wanted to be a part of. I'd always liked the idea of being an essayist in the style of the old sort of radicals of the early 20th century and the 19th century, when the printing press was the new mode of communication. And I really feel BreadTube has a lot of potential in that way to open up a lot of ideas to a lot of people. So, yeah, that's probably the aim. So my next question is from another fantastic YouTuber, Rugged Midwesterner, formerly known as Ron. Again, all go check out his channel. So Rugged Midwesterner asks, can you tell us how you do research for these videos? So one of the most important ways I do research for these videos is actually just having already read a lot of stuff. I've continued to read philosophy and academic texts since I finished university. And a lot of the work I'm doing at the minute is really based on returning to research that I did years ago and finally being able to do something with a lot of the reading that I've done for the last few years. But also I do read a lot of new stuff, and I tend to try and find some journal articles and some new discourse around the topic before I make a video. And of course, some of the stuff I read years ago, so I have to go back and reread and find the quotes that I want. So a lot of it is kind of reverse constructing arguments that I know I have. Luckily, I have quite a long list of these arguments that I still want to write that I've already researched, but I do have to try and keep up my reading in order to make sure that in future I will have more videos. However, I've just finished reading a really good book called Chav Solidarity by D. Hunter, which just came out in the UK, which I highly recommend, and I will probably be doing some videos relating to soon. So, that's something new. The last little bunch of questions I've got here in the personal section are from a channel called Notsflix. Now, I don't know if a lot of you will know Notsflix, but they are a fantastic channel, and I really want to recommend them because they're very, very small, but their videos are really good, and I think their project is really nice. So Notsflix is a channel dedicated to doing quite in-depth local history about the city of Nottingham in England, and I just think that this is a very good project to be doing, and trying to document your own local history from a radical perspective is a really interesting thing, and I'm really glad someone is doing that on YouTube, so I just want to give them a big thumbs up. Thanks, Blue. So, Notsflix has asked a few questions, but they're all quite short, so I'll go through them quite quickly. The first one is, do you have any more epic multi-hour series planned? Any spiritual successors to the dark side of liberalism? So, yes, actually I do. It may seem a little bit unoriginal, but the next one I'm planning on doing, and possibly going to do quite soon after my next couple of videos, will be a series based on another book from the same author, Ishay Lander, who wrote The Apprentice's Sorcerer, which the dark side of liberalism was largely based from. This other book I'm thinking of adapting is called The Overman in the Marketplace. It has a lot of crossover with the dark side of liberalism, but what it's actually doing is exploring the work of Friedrich Nietzsche and trying to explain why, in Lander's view, and I agree, a good socialist probably doesn't want anything to do with Nietzsche. So, look out for that soon. I'll try not to give any more away now. Notsflix also asks, did I have a creative outlet before the YouTube channel? And if so, what was it? I've had a few creative outlets in my life. I'm not sure I want to reference all of them here, because I'm not sure I'm really happy with all the work I've ever done for them. At one point, after the student occupations, I was involved in a project called Newcastle Free Press, where we did some local journalism from a political standpoint. I quite liked some of what I wrote for that publication. Some of it's terrible. I did used to have a blog, which lasted about 3 posts, but I never managed to keep up with it. I will not tell you the name, because I don't know if it still exists, but the theory is that it does. I've done a few other things over the years. A community radio show a few years ago with a comrade I knew from Broadfront Political Project, which was okay. Okay, so that's kind of my political creative outlets that I've had. I also do some music. I've played trumpet and sang in some bands. I'm not going to tell you which ones here, but most of them were not particularly political, and the one that was, I used to write the songs for, and there's not very much of our work online, but I don't really want to direct you to it, because I kind of think the songs that I wrote back then were not that great. So, sorry. So Notsflix's last 2 questions were, what made you decide to give video making a go, and how long were you toying with the idea before you actually committed? Well, I kind of talked about that in response to Katherine's question. So, yeah, that's the personal ones done. Before I get onto the theory questions, I'll just take a moment to talk about some of the funnier questions that have been asked. So, Andre on Twitter asks, Tulsi or Bernie? I think that's pretty obvious. I think obviously Bernie. I mean, I think there's a lot of problems with Bernie Sanders, Certainly, I don't think that the Sanders campaign is going to overthrow capitalism, but I think that if I was making the decision, obviously I don't have to because I'm in the UK, then Bernie Sanders would be the candidate that I would support for president. Anarchadog asks, how much would I have to pay you to join the Stalin Society? Well, I mean, quite a lot of money. I'm not sure what else to say at that. Certainly.
But you can be bought.
Well, I mean, how long do I have to stay in the Stalin Society? Can I try and bring it down from the inside? Do I have to conform to the needs of the Stalin Society? I mean, if it involves actually doing Stalinism, then I'm not game. And Radical Reviewer asks, what's your favourite musical artist? I'm going to do that massive cop-out thing where I say I've got a really broad taste in music, and that's true. But I do want to talk about maybe some musical artists that I do really enjoy. For a long time I've been a really big fan of The Clash. Really like their music. I like a lot of old punk, things like Crass and stuff like that, obviously. But I also like a lot of other music. I really like jazz music. As a trumpeter, that's something that I tend to be into. But I kind of grew up listening to a lot of jazz and classical music. And, I had classical music lessons when I was a kid. So I like a lot of that sort of stuff as well. Some of my favourite artists, I don't have a single favourite, but yeah, Nina Simone would be another one. I'm a massive fan of Nina Simone. And one artist who's been quite important to me and to Blue recently has been Janelle Monáe, whose work I really, really enjoy, and who we actually went to see live just a couple of days ago at the time of filming in London, and that was really, really cool. I think Janelle Monáe is interesting to mention here just because I think there's maybe a bit of a point to be brought out in talking about my experience of getting into her music. So, for a long time I was kind of into a lot of music, but like modern R&B was something that I kind of felt quite averse to, and I didn't feel like that music was for me. But it was only through Janelle Monáe and through her album Arch Android, which has so many different styles going on, and as I think Blue pointed out first, it's quite like the Clash's album Sandinista in the way that it experiments with styles and effects and things like that, that I really started to realise that this was a style of music that I quite liked. And I kind of had the realisation that maybe the reason I didn't like it before was because a lot of it is coded very female, and that, in a sort of toxic masculine culture, I've been brought up to think that it was in some way lesser for me to enjoy this music. So I'm very thankful to Janelle Monáe for providing an access point to the R&B genre for me generally, and it's led me to go back and listen to a lot of artists that I previously discounted with new ears, like Lauryn Hill and even Beyonce and stuff like that. So yeah, that's really cool. So that's that question done. Okay, so now on to the theoretical questions. So now I'm going to try and briefly answer some of the theoretical questions that people have asked me. I want to point out that I haven't done any research for this video, so these are my off-the-cuff, unscripted responses to these questions. Let's give it a go. So, the first two questions are from Radical Reviewer. Hi, Radical Reviewer. For anyone who doesn't know, Radical Reviewer is the best dog on the anarchist left, and has a fantastic channel, so you should go and check him out. And we did a collaboration just a short time ago at the time that this comes out, so go check that out. We reviewed Capitalist Realism. So Radical Reviewer has asked me some difficult questions. The first one is, how do we provide adequate food, clothes, shelter, medical needs, etc. for all people while avoiding ecocide? And, well, that's a big issue. I'm inclined to say that obviously I don't have a strict technical answer to this, but really the answer is through systems of collective distribution. What we need to do, I suppose, is to try and make our energy production as green as possible, make all our material production as green as possible, and have sufficient systems of distribution to make the sharing of these goods across society fair and even. And once we have done that, we can then start looking at how much stuff people need and how much stuff we can safely produce. Fuck me, this is a shitty answer. So the answer to this question for me starts with trying to do it. I don't think, if we don't try and at least look at how we do this, I don't think we will ever know. So I think it needs a large, organised approach. Obviously, we need to tackle climate change, and we need to tackle it from the top. We need to tackle the big polluters, not content ourselves with just doing this sort of like consumer anti-climate change stuff that doesn't achieve anything. I really don't think that we know whether we can provide adequate food, clothes and shelter for everyone on the planet without causing ecocide until we try. I think we probably can. I think that if we share our resources in a sensible way, that we can probably do this while moving from fossil fuels very quickly to green technologies, which obviously we need to do. I think having systems of distribution like that will help even if there are problems with doing this. Say, if we do find that there is too much power demand for us to produce with renewables, it's much easier to engage with and justify something like a rolling blackout if everyone already knows they're getting a fair share of everything. If people don't feel like, oh, there's some guys who get electricity all the time, and then there's me who just gets a bit of electricity sometimes. I think that in order to answer this question, we need to start trying to answer it. I think in a capitalist society, we're not interested in providing for everyone anyway, and so we aren't even trying to create responses to this question. So there's a really good evasion of that answer. Another question from Radical Reviewer. Given that capitalism is killing the planet and will kill those who resist it if necessary, what does this mean for our tactics? Wow. So, I mean, I think it means we have to try and work very quickly because capitalism is killing the planet. In terms of tactics for the left, I think responding to a question like this, we could get kind of carried away and try and start prefiguring sorts of action which we haven't engaged in yet. Right now, I really think that, sadly, while it has been growing a lot, the left is not in a strong position to take power in any particular way. So I think the strategy that's really needed right now is community engagement. I think we need to be going into our communities and doing positive things from a political standpoint to show our goodwill and to help people understand solidarity and start to engage with it. And from there, we can start to build consciousness of the ideas that people need in order to move forward in society. This is a really hard process, but it's something that we need to do really quickly. And I think it's much more important to think about right now than thinking about the radical ruptures that might come in the future, because we will never get to the point of being able to act in any radical rupture that happens to happen. I think this is much more important than trying to chase the next flashpoint or think about prefiguratively what will happen at a great rupture in society, say in a crisis point around climate change. I think that's also important to think about, but we will not have the resources or ability to act in the ways that we might like to if we don't have engagement with communities and if we aren't connected to the sort of vulnerable people who need to have an outlet to be able to express these struggles, and if we're not organising with the people that we want to stand for. So I think that community organising and union organising are the major things that the left ought to be doing at the moment, and I'm going to talk about this more in a video very soon. As for this actual idea of whether people will kill people who resist it, well, you know, this is clearly what has happened before, and I think once you have a community movement together that's ready to enact a new society in the shadow of the old, and to take the rug from under the feet of the capitalists and the authoritarians who are running our society, then that's a question you have to answer at that point. And certainly if at that point the ruling classes do try and oppose you with military force, as they historically have done, then I think there is absolute justification for being able to respond to that. But again, what I want to emphasise is that right now, I think the most important thing is being engaged in our communities and showing our goodwill. I think the left spends far too much time grandstanding about its ideas, which is also important, but not enough time trying to put them into practice and show people that actually we can make people's lives better through these ideas. So the last of the theoretical questions is from Notsflix again. Should calls for violence against rich people or billionaires be considered hate speech? I ask because I've seen a lot of guillotine memes on my Facebook recently. Well, this is an interesting question, and some philosophers, notably Foucault, I think actually would agree that those were hate speech. I'm not sure I agree with Foucault on this, and actually the passage where he talks about this is one which I reread in making my recent Foucault video, and one which I realised that I disagree with a lot more than I did the first time I read it. Personally, I think that speech against billionaires or the rich happens in a structure of violence, which is downward facing. So I think it goes against the vertical lines of oppression rather than with them, like, say, racism does. It is a resistant form of speech rather than one that is about putting down or oppressing certain people. In this way, I think it is more morally justifiable. In the same way, it's more morally justifiable for a person of colour to complain about white people doing stuff than it is for a white person to complain about people of colour doing stuff. That being said, I'm not sure it's always the most useful discourse, and like I say, really, at the stage we are now, we really, I think, need to be outward-looking and trying to engage with communities on their own terms and helping them to lead their own struggles and campaigns, rather than trying to draw them into some sort of torch and pitchfork mob, or something like that. And obviously, I think any sort of preemptive violence in the way that the far right do, in sort of terrorist kind of actions or assassination attempts, things like that, I think that's not really productive or useful strategy, and not something that I think that anyone on the left should be doing. That being said, being able to defend yourself and have self-reliance and, stand up to fascists who are trying to attack your communities, those are really important things to do, and I do think it is important for people to be aware of how to defend themselves. Is that right? Extra special thanks to our $10 patrons, George Soros and Peter Benzoni.
Hello and welcome to the very first Dumpster Flower Q&A. Your first question, Dumpster Flower.
We could do that. Maybe that would be easier.
Hi everybody, thanks for getting me to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. I'm here to do a Q&A so you can learn some more about me.
That's not my parasocial persona. I think you've been misunderstanding what I've been portraying. I think that would be jarring to my viewers. Hi, PD.